I'd like to think that maybe this company will be better after Vince McMahon is dead. But the fact is, it's going to be taken over by his idiotic daughter and his doofus son-in-law. And the rest of you people will just be kissing their ass like you're kissing Vince's ass right now." The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just detonated. But CM Punk wasn't finished. What he said next would target Hulk Hogan directly and create one of the most controversial moments in WWE history. June 27, 2011. Monday Night Raw, Chicago, Illinois, All-State Arena. The crowd was electric, sensing they were about to witness something unprecedented. CM Punk sat cross-legged on the stage, microphone in hand, speaking truths that WWE didn't want the world to hear. This wasn't a scripted promo. This was CM Punk going completely off script, burning bridges, and calling out everyone who represented everything wrong with WWE. And Hulk Hogan, despite not even being in the building, was about to become his primary target. "You know what's really sad?" Punk continued, his voice dripping with disdain. "The fact that guys like Hulk Hogan still think they're relevant, still think they deserve to be in main events when guys like me and Daniel Bryan and everyone else in that locker room are busting their asses every single night." The camera operators looked at each other nervously. This wasn't in the script. Nobody knew where Punk was going with this, but they couldn't cut away now. The audience was captivated. "Hulk Hogan epitomizes everything that's wrong with this business," Punk said, his voice rising. "A guy who's been coasting on nostalgia for 20 years, taking spots from people who actually deserve them, playing politics backstage to make sure he stays relevant when he should have gracefully stepped aside a decade ago." Backstage, WWE executives were scrambling. Vince McMahon was reportedly furious, but also fascinated by the raw emotion and genuine passion in Punk's voice. This was real. This was dangerous. This was television gold. But what made this moment even more significant was that it wasn't just a random attack. CM Punk had real grievances against Hulk Hogan, grievances that had been building for years. The backstory began in 2010, when rumors circulated that WWE was considering bringing Hulk Hogan back for another main event run. Punk, who had been grinding in the mid-card despite being one of the most talented wrestlers in the company, was disgusted by the idea. "Here I am, working 300 days a year, putting on the best matches, cutting the best promos, and they want to bring back Hulk Hogan to main event WrestleMania." Punk had complained to friends backstage. "A guy who can barely move, who hasn't had a good match in 15 years, who's just going to come in, collect a massive paycheck, and leave." The frustration had been building for months. Punk watched as part-time legends like The Rock got main event spots while full-time performers like him were relegated to secondary roles. But Hogan represented something even worse than The Rock. At least The Rock could still perform at a high level when he returned. Hogan was just a shadow of his former self, relying entirely on nostalgia and crowd reactions. The breaking point came when Punk learned that WWE had seriously discussed having Hogan win a championship in 2011. The idea was eventually scrapped, but the fact that it was even considered sent Punk over the edge. They're literally considering giving the WWE Championship to a 58-year-old man who can't bump, can't work, and hasn't been relevant since the 1980s, Punk told a close friend. "Meanwhile, I'm in my prime, I'm the best wrestler in the company, and I'm fighting for scraps." So when Punk sat on that stage in Chicago and decided to speak his mind, Hulk Hogan became a symbol of everything he hated about WWE's priorities. "You want to know why this company is in trouble?" Punk continued his rant. "Because instead of building new stars, instead of investing in the future, they keep going back to the same old well. They keep bringing back guys like Hulk Hogan who should be home playing with their grandchildren, not taking up TV time that should be going to people who are actually in their prime." The crowd was eating it up. Chicago had always been a smart crowd, and they understood exactly what Punk was talking about. They had watched talented wrestlers get passed over for aging legends countless times. Hulk Hogan represents everything that's wrong with the wrestling business, Punk said, his voice now filled with genuine anger. The politics, the backstage manipulation, the refusal to pass the torch. He's had his time. His time was 30 years ago. But he can't let go, and WWE can't stop enabling him. What made these comments particularly devastating was that they were largely accurate. Hogan had been accused of using his backstage influence to maintain his position long past his prime. Stories of Hogan refusing to put over younger talent were legendary in wrestling circles. Behind the scenes, WWE officials were having heated discussions about whether to cut Punk's microphone. But they couldn't. The segment was generating too much buzz, too much genuine emotion. This was the kind of authentic moment that wrestling rarely captured anymore. You know what the worst part is? Punk continued. Guys like Hogan have convinced themselves that they're doing this for the fans, that they're giving people what they want. But what they're really doing is holding everyone else back. They're preventing the next generation from having their moment because they can't stand the idea of not being the center of attention. The personal nature of these attacks was what made them so shocking. This wasn't just Punk complaining about WWE's booking decisions. This was him calling out Hogan's character, his motivations, his entire approach to the business. As Punk's rant continued, focusing on other aspects of WWE's problems, the wrestling world was already reacting to his comments about Hogan. Social media exploded with fans debating whether Punk had gone too far or whether he was simply saying what everyone was thinking. Hulk Hogan, who was under contract with TNA Wrestling at the time, initially stayed silent about Punk's comments. But privately, according to wrestling insiders, he was furious. Hogan had always prided himself on being a company man, on doing what was best for business. To have someone publicly question his motivations and his relevance was deeply insulting. The wrestling media was divided. Some praised Punk for his honesty and courage in speaking out against WWE's reliance on past stars. Others criticized him for being unprofessional and disrespectful to legends who had paved the way for his career. But what everyone agreed on was that Punk had articulated frustrations that many current wrestlers felt, but were afraid to express publicly. The wrestling business had always been about paying dues and respecting your elders. But Punk was arguing that respect should have limits when it comes at the expense of current performers. WWE's reaction to Punk's comments was complicated. Publicly, they couldn't endorse his attacks on company legends, but privately, some executives agreed with his points about the need to focus more on current talent. The segment became known as the Pipe Bomb promo, and it fundamentally changed CM Punk's career trajectory. Within months, he was WWE champion and one of the company's top stars. But his comments about Hulk Hogan remained controversial throughout his WWE run. Years later, when both Punk and Hogan had left WWE under different circumstances, the wrestling world looked back at that moment as a turning point. Punk had articulated a generational divide that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. In retrospect, Punk's criticisms of Hogan proved to be prescient. Hogan's subsequent controversies, including the racist comments that led to his firing from WWE, validated many of Punk's concerns about WWE's continued association with him. The Pipe Bomb promo also established a template for how current wrestlers could critique the industry's problems without getting fired. By mixing legitimate grievances with entertainment value, Punk showed that controversy could be profitable when handled correctly. But perhaps most importantly, Punk's comments about Hogan represented a changing of the guard in professional wrestling. The era of unquestioning respect for legends was ending, replaced by a more critical examination of their continued relevance and impact on the business. Today, CM Punk's attack on Hulk Hogan is remembered as one of the most honest and impactful promos in wrestling history. It wasn't just entertainment, It was a performer using his platform to address real problems in the industry, regardless of the personal and professional consequences. The fact that WWE allowed it to happen, and that it ultimately benefited both Punk's career and the company's creative direction, proved that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is tell the truth. And in that moment in Chicago, CM Punk told a truth about Hulk Hogan that the wrestling world needed to hear, even if they weren't ready for it. The immediate aftermath of Punk's comments created shockwaves throughout the wrestling industry. Within hours, wrestling websites were analyzing every word of his rant, with Hogan's segment receiving particular attention from journalists and fans alike. Dave Meltzer, the most respected wrestling journalist of his generation, wrote extensively about Punk's comments, noting that while they were harsh, they reflected legitimate concerns shared by many wrestlers about WWE's booking priorities and Hogan's continued influence despite his diminished abilities. Other wrestlers, speaking anonymously to wrestling publications, expressed support for Punk's position while acknowledging they could never say such things publicly themselves. He said what we've all been thinking. One mid-card wrestler told Pro Wrestling Illustrated, "Hogan's time is over, but nobody has the balls to say it except Punk." The reaction from wrestling legends was mixed. Some, like Mick Foley, defended Punk's right to express his opinion while suggesting his delivery could have been more respectful. Others, particularly those from Hogan's era, were offended by what they saw as disrespectful attacks on someone who had helped build the industry. Steve Austin, who had his own complicated relationship with WWE's booking decisions, offered a nuanced take. "I understand Punk's frustration, but Hogan earned his spot in this business. That said, there comes a time when everyone needs to step aside and let the next generation take over." The Rock, who was also making part-time appearances around this period, was notably silent about Punk's comments, perhaps recognizing that some of the criticism about part-time performers could apply to him as well. Within WWE, the response was carefully managed. Publicly, company officials distanced themselves from Punk's comments about Hogan, emphasizing respect for wrestling legends. Privately, however, several executives acknowledged that Punk had raised valid points about the company's creative direction. Triple H, who was beginning to take on more creative responsibilities within WWE, later admitted that Punk's promo had sparked important internal discussions about balancing nostalgia with developing current talent. "Punk challenged us to think differently about our priorities," Triple H said in a later interview. Even when he was being controversial, he was making points that needed to be considered. The impact on Hulk Hogan was significant, though he initially tried to downplay it. In TNA Wrestling, where he was working at the time, Hogan made subtle references to young guys who don't understand respect, but he avoided directly addressing Punk's specific criticisms. However, according to wrestling insiders, Hogan was deeply affected by the public nature of Punk's attack. For someone who had spent decades carefully managing his public image, having his relevance and motivations questioned so directly on national television was particularly painful. The situation became more complicated when TNA Wrestling attempted to capitalize on the controversy by having Hogan address Punk's comments during a TNA broadcast. However, the response fell flat, with many observers noting that Hogan seemed defensive and out of touch with the legitimate concerns Punk had raised. The long-term impact of Punk's comments extended far beyond the immediate controversy. WWE began to shift its focus more toward current talent, with part-time legend appearances becoming more sporadic and strategic rather than routine. Young wrestlers within WWE took notice of Punk's success following his outspoken promo. While few were willing to be as direct in their criticisms, many began to advocate more assertively for better opportunities and treatment within the company. The wrestling media also changed its coverage approach, becoming more willing to examine the business aspects of wrestling decisions rather than simply reporting them as entertainment storylines. Punk's willingness to break the fourth wall had opened up new possibilities for wrestling journalism. Wrestling schools began teaching students about the CM Punk model, using legitimate grievances and authentic emotion to create compelling television, even when it involved criticizing company policies or established stars. The relationship between current wrestlers and legends became more complex as well. While respect for veterans remained important, Punk had demonstrated that blind deference was no longer expected or necessary. Current performers felt more empowered to question decisions that they felt were detrimental to their careers. For CM Punk himself, the promo became a defining moment that established him as someone willing to speak truth to power, regardless of the consequences. This reputation served him well throughout his WWE career and beyond, as fans knew they could trust him to give his honest opinion on controversial topics. The Hulk Hogan aspect of Punk's promo also proved to be prophetic in ways that weren't apparent at the time. Years later, when Hogan's racist comments came to light and he was fired from WWE, many wrestling fans remembered Punk's criticisms about WWE's continued association with problematic legends. Wrestling historians now point to Punk's pipe bomb promo, and specifically his comments about Hogan, as a turning point in how the wrestling business handles the relationship between current performers and legendary figures from previous eras. The moment also demonstrated the power of authentic emotion in professional wrestling. While the business had become increasingly scripted and controlled by the 2010s, Punk's genuine passion and legitimate grievances created a level of engagement that scripted promos rarely achieved. Today, when wrestling performers speak out about industry problems, they're often compared to CM Punk's approach on that night in Chicago. His willingness to name specific names, including Hulk Hogan, set a standard for honesty and directness that influenced how wrestlers advocate for themselves and their peers. The legacy of that moment extends beyond wrestling as well. In an era of corporate control and carefully managed public statements, Punk's decision to speak his mind, consequences be damned, resonated with audiences who rarely hear such unfiltered opinions from public figures. Looking back, CM Punk's attack on Hulk Hogan during the pipe bomb promo represents more than just one wrestler criticizing another. It represents a generational shift, a change in how the wrestling business operates, and a reminder that sometimes progress requires someone to be willing to say what everyone else is thinking but afraid to express. The courage it took for Punk to call out Hogan specifically by name on live television cannot be understated. In an industry built on hierarchies and unwritten rules about respecting your elders, Punk shattered those conventions in pursuit of what he believed was a greater truth about the direction of professional wrestling.